So in this section, we're going to talk about managing websites. We're going to get more into this a little bit later on in the semester, and this is kind of a primer for the final project. This is kind of bringing all the things that we've learned together into kind of a coherent server strategy. So when we're managing websites, particularly when we're managing servers, we're always going to be talking in terms of stacks. And when I say stacks, what I mean is the different parts of the server that need to all come together in order to run our website or our web application properly. And typically a stack looks like this. The very bottom layer of the stack is going to be our operating system, and that's what's going to manage the very low-level parts of our site. So the file system, the drives, the internet connection, all of that type of thing is going to be managed at the operating system level. We're also going to have web servers, which is either going to be Nginx or Apache or some of the other Ruby or Node-based web servers that we've been talking about in this class. In addition to that, we'll have a database like MySQL or Postgres. And then we'll have language support, which is actually sometimes lower down by the operating system, but this is going to be things like PHP or Ruby or any other language, or Python, for example, that your website or your web application might need to support. So if you're using Ruby on Rails, you're going to need to have Ruby installed. If you're running WordPress, you'll need to have PHP installed. If you're running any of the other stacks like Node, you might need JavaScript installed. So your operating system needs to be able to support those languages. So all of those different things kind of stack together to create the infrastructure we need to run our website. So a pretty common stack you've probably heard of is the LAMP stack. And this is made up of Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. And this is a very common web framework, web stack that's used all over the internet, particularly with WordPress. This is the common stack. So in our example here, we have an Ubuntu flavor of Linux, just like we've been using throughout this class. Apache 2.x as our web server, MySQL 5, and PHP 5. With this stack, which is relatively easy to install using the apt-get system on Ubuntu, you can run a whole host of websites and web services that don't require any other additional software or information to work. So this is very common, it's very stable, and it can run a ton of different applications. And this is what you might see in a typical Ruby on Rails stack. And this is simplified, and there are definitely more complicated ways to run a Rails stack. But again, our foundation operating system is Linux. Our web servers are Passenger and Nginx for actually dealing with the web connections. We still use MySQL 5, and then we need Ruby as our language support. And in some of the newer Rails stacks, you might replace MySQL with Postgres, which is another relational database similar to MySQL. And you might have other web servers in the middleware section, like possibly Unicorn or other Ruby-based web servers, or maybe even JRuby if you're running your Ruby stack in a Java environment. So MySQL is a website or is a database that we're going to be using in this class fairly extensively, and it's very easy to install in Ubuntu, and it's the foundation of most websites, and it's a very, very good, if you're going to learn a database software, it's a good one to learn. It's relatively easy, very stable, and it works with a whole host of different applications. It's open source relational database, which means our databases aren't flat files. They're built with foreign keys and IDs to reference other tables, and that's a whole nother show, but we'll get into look at the show notes below on relational databases. It's very common on the web. It's the go-to database for PHP developers, and it has widespread support on multiple platforms, including Unix and Windows and Mac OS X, and you name it, it will run. It's very easy to install. apt-get install MySQL Server. You need to make sure that you install MySQL Server and not just the client. There's a client app and a server app. If you're not running the server on your server, you only need the client app if you just need your applications to talk to a MySQL server. If you want to actually run a MySQL server on your Ubuntu install, you need to install the MySQL Server application. And depending on what language you're using, you'll also need to install the language MySQL supports. So sometimes these are called bindings, but Python, Ruby, PHP, they all have MySQL bindings. So they have low-level language support for MySQL so that your programming language, operating system, and database can all talk together nicely. So in our case, if we were using WordPress and PHP, we'd need to make sure we install the PHP 5 MySQL binary. And this is just a simple login for MySQL. Once you've installed it, you can go to MySQL urootp, and this will log you in as the root user. And then you can create a database. And we'll actually get into more on MySQL in the next lesson. We're gonna get into that a little bit more and spend most of our time on databases this week. So there's also a create database command for WordPress. And this can all be done in the command line. It's a MySQL shell that kind of takes over the Linux shell and allows you to run SQL statements and to create users and manage your MySQL databases. And just like in Linux, MySQL has a root user, which is kind of the all-powerful user, which can create and destroy databases on a whim. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So the other thing we need to look at is how we actually organize websites on our server. And it's not good to just kind of haphazardly populate your var www directory with sites. You want to have some kind of organization to it. And typically this is how I set up my sites, especially when I want to host multiple sites on a single server. So from my home directory, I'll create a public HTML folder. And then within that, I'll create separate folders for each site that I want to run. And that way I know all my public-facing data and all my public-facing documents are all going to be in that public HTML folder organized by site. And within that site, I'll create a public folder which will actually be accessible to the outside world. And then I'll create two other folders, typically a log folder and a backup folder. The backup folder is where I will dump MySQL backups, database backups, any other documents that I want backed up. And the log file is where I'll rewrite my site-specific logs to go. So this is our access logs and our error logs from Apache or Nginx. We'll write into that directory. And you can change the location of those logs using in your virtual host setup within the Apache configuration. WordPress is a content management system that we're going to get into a little bit later, not this week, but next week. And this will also kind of be the foundation of the first full stack that we build up. And WordPress is an open source blogging and content management system built on top of the LAMP stack. And it just uses PHP, MySQL, and it has this great self-install, and as long as you get the parts up and running, you can actually get your own WordPress blog up and running fairly quickly without the need for additional hosting or installers. So it's very powerful, and it uses everything we've just talked about. It will even fit in the framework of our site structure that we just looked at. So this is typically what a WordPress site would look like in our directory with our index.php, our configuration files, WordPress content. We'll get into a little bit more of that next week. We're going to focus this week primarily on the database stuff that's going to run this, and then next week we'll get into WordPress. This is just a dashboard screenshot. I'm sure some of you are familiar with WordPress, and this should not be anything too new. These are also two other fairly popular content management systems. Joomla is a PHP, MySQL content management system that runs in a very similar way to WordPress. It's not as blog-centric. It's more content management-centric. Jekyll is a Ruby-based blog-aware static site generator. So that's kind of a mouthful, but it's basically a blogging platform that generates static files that you can then upload to a server without having the need to have WordPress or PHP or MySQL installed. It will just run plain old HTML and CSS. So that's a very cool option as well. We'll get into that later. So we're going to move on from here, and we're going to focus on databases this week. I just wanted to give you guys a brief overview of kind of some basic site organization and what you can expect in the coming weeks. So in the next lesson, we're going to dive into MySQL and MongoDB a little bit, and then your assignment for this week will be a MongoDB primer because it's kind of a cool database technology, and I really want you to check it out. So we'll see you in the next video.